Father, I pray that as we embark on this study, you bless us, Lord, and I pray that you'd enable me to study and to prepare adequately and to communicate your truth, that we might understand this gospel, we might understand its message, and we might be blessed by it, and we might be changed by it. We ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so at long last, after much delay and hoo-ha, we come to Mark's Gospel. As we kick off, I just want to say a couple of things as we kick in by way of introduction. One for me personally and one to do with tonight. For me personally, just so you know, we talked a bit this morning about the need for prayer for our visa situation and oh gosh, there's some people who weren't here this morning. Long story short, we have to be out of the country by the 6th of December if our visa hasn't arrived, and it may not. So we're kind of really praying towards that deadline now. We could come back again, and we will. We're not deserting the church or anything like that, but we won't be able to come back until the visa is organised and dealt with. So life hasn't been easy for the last few years for us as a family, and I had an incident 5 years ago in England where just through difficult circumstances I got severe depression, which has never really left, and my brain kind of stopped working properly. And it's very hard to explain, but I used to read books and just devour them and just kind of fill my mind with knowledge and what have you, and I really struggle just to read now and to study and to concentrate and what have you. And I say all of that because when I teach a book like Ephesians in the morning, I'm teaching a book I've taught a couple of times before. I know the gist of it, I know the flow, and I'm learning new things as I prepare every time, and I'm seeing connections I hadn't seen before and things like that. But if I have an awful week and if my mind goes into kind of a meltdown and shutdown, I can still get by on a Sunday normally by the grace of God. Mark scares the living daylights out of me because I've never taught it before. And I've never, it's not like Mark wrote other books. So I have no familiarity with his style. I don't know the literary devices. I'm the way that I'm very familiar with Paul's thought and the way he links things together. I'm very familiar with John and the way he communicates. But Mark is just all new to me. So I'm really petrified of teaching Mark's gospel, because if I have a bad week, you might get a really awful sermon. I'm hoping not, but God's been very graceful to me during this period of time. But I ask that you would pray for my healing in this regard, and I also just ask that you would carry me in prayer through this series. We're now looking at a period of probably, realistically speaking, 6 months to a year in Mark. So it's a big investment of time for me and for you who follow. So please keep it in prayer week by week. The second thing by way of introduction, just with regards to this introductory sermon, I'm hoping that this sermon will be up on the website along with all the other sermons on Mark, and I'm hoping that when we finish Mark, we'll take it down. I'm hoping that when we finish Mark, I'll do a summation, and the summation will go at the beginning. Because the horrible thing about doing an introduction to Mark is I don't know Mark that well yet. I mean, I've done my reading on the introductory elements of Mark, which I'm going to kind of present to you today, but it's going to kind of make sense at the end, not at the beginning. And so what we've seen and the way he writes and what he's communicating and the main themes and how it fits together, although I understand the outlines of it now, I'll have it filled in so much better at the end. So for me, introductions should always be done at the end of a book. Can you imagine when we get to the end of Ephesians, just when it's fresh in my mind, how I'd be able to summarize the entire book and just explain how it all links together. And it's something that at the beginning of Ephesians I wouldn't have done as well, because I've spent the last 6 months or so teaching Ephesians. So this is a temporary introduction, which is here just as a way of giving you a bit of an introduction so you know where we're going, next time we'll be kicking off with chapter 1, verse 1 properly. But we'll have a little look through today at this gospel. So what do we know about Mark? Let's talk about Mark's gospel. Mark is very closely linked to the disciple Peter, the apostle Peter. And there has long been this historical teaching that Peter and Mark were very much working together, or he was certainly the main source for this gospel. We believe that Mark was the first of the gospels written, though not everybody agrees with that. But there are certainly things externally, in other words, things in evidence in history generally that would point that way. But there's also much evidence internally within the text itself. And we think that Mark was written very, very early. Most evangelical scholars think that Mark was written somewhere between 50 and 60 AD. I'm not convinced of that myself. I think it might be even earlier. I think this was written at the latest 20 years after the death of Christ. Perhaps much sooner. You have to remember that for something to be written and then for that same thing to be copied enough times for it to be widespread is a very different thing. It wasn't the era of the internet where you posted something online and it goes viral in 6 hours, you know. We're talking about things having to be copied by hand. And I suspect that there is much here, and we'll go through some of it tonight, that suggests that this was a very, not rushed so much as just written with a sense of urgency. There needed to be something out there, some sort of record. And the Gospels are all different. You see, when Matthew writes his Gospel, Matthew's mind is very, very much focused on the Jewish reader. Matthew is trying to use the Old Testament scriptures, in particular the book of Jeremiah, and the parallels with Jeremiah and Matthew are very clear there. But he's trying to use so much of the Old Testament to show that this was the Jewish Messiah, that this was the person the Jews were waiting for. Luke is often accused of being a Gentile. I don't believe he was. I think he was a Jew as well. But it was certainly a gospel that was written more to the Gentiles. It was a more systematic presentation. Luke actually wrote 2 books. He wrote the Gospel of Luke and he wrote the book of Acts, which is essentially just Luke part 2. Luke is writing a single story that stretches from the beginning of the Gospel right the way through to the end of the book of Acts. And perhaps his writing of both of them had to do with a presentation on behalf of Paul, who was facing imminent judgment and death. And so he writes he was a doctor. He writes in a very systematic and almost scientific way. So with Luke, he says at the beginning of his gospel that he's writing an orderly account. And whenever you use that word orderly, and I've looked at the use of it throughout Scripture, it seems to always refer in the Scripture, in the Old Testament, which was translated into Greek, it seems to refer to something in chronological sequence. So you know from Luke's gospel that this happened before this happened before this happened, right? But Mark and Matthew and John aren't like that at all. They're writing themes. Now, John's Gospel is my favourite. I just adore John's Gospel. It's the most majestic of Gospels. It's teaching very, very clearly the deity of Jesus Christ. It's talking about the glory of Christ and how the character and the covenant-keeping nature of God is glorified through the person of Jesus Christ. And so these Gospels all have their different themes and their different aims. And so with Mark's Gospel, there are elements showing to whom he was writing. But I think of all the Gospels, one of the things that characterizes Mark's Gospel most of all is the sense of urgency. Now, if you're there in Mark's Gospel, if you turn to chapter 1, there is in Mark's Gospel the use of the word immediately. Chapter 1 and verse 12, the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. Then in verse 18, and immediately they left their nets. Verse 21, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath. Verse 23, and immediately in their synagogue, a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out. And verse 29, and immediately he left the synagogue. Now, it's not a common word. Luke uses it, I believe, a total of once. Matthew uses it 5 times. And Mark uses it 42 times. 42. And everybody tends to write about this sense of urgency. I'm not convinced that it means immediately in the urgent sense that we might use the word. It's almost like a saying. It's like a transition from then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's not, when we hear the word, and we'll talk about more as we get into the text next time, but when we hear the word immediately, we think something's happened. There is no pause, there's no break in time, and then this happens immediately afterwards in chronological sequence. Right? That's what we think of with immediately. But what he's saying is, this happened, oh, and this happened, oh, and this happened. So it's not a chronological thing. He's not saying this happened immediately after this. What he's saying is it's almost like, and there's probably better examples, but let me give you my personal one, like an episode of Seinfeld. I come from England, and English TV, English humour in particular, is much slower and drier. And one of the first thing I noticed when I watched an import version of Seinfeld on TV was how quick the scenes were. In an English sitcom, in a situation comedy in England on TV, you can have an entire episode in one room and it's one scene. Because it's all the development of the characters. And then I watched Seinfeld and it was boom, change scene. Boom, change scene. And I'm like, whoa, slow down a second. This is like a sequence of little mini things like adverts, you know. I couldn't keep up with it. It was a real shocker to me. This very quick sequence. And I think that's a better understanding of what Mark is doing with the word immediately. He's saying, look, you need to know that this happened. 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 And he's jumping from incident to incident, from scene to scene. And it's almost like the way that Selah is a musical term in the Psalms used to say going from this now to this, whatever this is. In Mark immediately is taking you from one incident to another to another. And I get the impression with Mark that it was written in such a way as to just get stuff out there about Jesus as quick as possible. By the time the last gospel was written, which most people think was John, I'm not 100% convinced. I'm going to do some proper study about that in a few years' time. But most people think that John was the last of the Gospels. And by the time he writes, he's like, I'm writing to you for this particular reason. He's got a theme. He's put everything together. The words are very cleverly chosen. There's these very, very clever literary devices. He's linking this with this. He's referencing that. He's alluding to this. And it's almost Pauline. It's almost a bit like Paul's letters, in the way that he's carefully weaved it together. In fact, some of us think that maybe Paul might have been involved in the writing of John's Gospel, not so much as helping him write, but in the sense that John may have had some of Paul's early letters, in particular Ephesians, at the time he wrote his Gospel. He may have had a copy of that. If you've got one letter that's been written, an original, right? The original. And now there's copies being made, right? You've now got one copy, two copies, three copies. It takes time, right? To speed the process up, those early copies would presumably have been used so that more people can make more copies, right? But as soon as the first copies start to go out, who's going to get them? It's going to be the important people, right? And the important people when they were alive were the apostles. So I think that some of Paul's writings may be in front of John. But with Mark, his literary devices, I don't think the word clunky is quite right, but his literary devices are a little bit more basic. It's not quite as carefully woven as, say, John's Gospel is. So these other Gospels come along, and particularly with Matthew and Luke, I don't want to get into the scholarly stuff, but some of you will be familiar with the term synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share the bulk of the same stories and the same, incidents and the same information. And Matthew has taken the stuff that's relevant to his cause, and Luke is putting his scientifically minded, historical, everything in sequence sort of thing together for the Gentiles. And I think with Mark, most scholars think that's our starting point, and he's just saying, look, here it is, this is what Jesus did. And so the first of the Gospels, a sequence of events, and him putting together the stories of Christ's life that the others would then more carefully weave into their themes later on. And Mark was just saying, here it is, and here it is quickly. And I think one of the best examples or evidences for that is at the end of Mark's Gospel. Let's turn there. I'm dreading chapter 16. Because when we hit chapter 16, we have to deal with the unenviable task of dealing with textual criticism. Textual criticism is when we have multiple Greek manuscripts that have different texts. And we have to determine, as unbiasedly as we can, which text was in the original writing that Mark wrote. And there are two passages in the Gospels that are very, very long that are disputed. We have the oldest manuscripts that we have, and some of the most reliable manuscripts that we have do not contain these long passages. And in John's Gospel, it's famously the woman who was caught in adultery. And in Mark's Gospel, it's the ending. Now, I don't know what your Bible does here. If you have a King James or a New King James, it may not mention it other than the briefest of footnotes. Some modern versions simply do not have the last section at all. Some put it in smaller text and put it in brackets. I have an ESV in front of me, and it has a large interjection saying some of the earliest manuscripts do not include chapter 16, verses 9 to 20. And then 9 to 20 is in print, but it's in double parentheses. Double brackets, as we say in England. And I will deal with that when we come to chapter 16. It's going to be hard to deal with because, people who have used the King James their whole lives feel like you're taking away part of their Bible. And people get very offended by that. The reality is that when the King James was translated hundreds of years ago, back in the 1600s, there were very few manuscripts available, and the ones that were available were very, very late. Since then, and particularly in the 1800s and early 1900s, we have a wealth of manuscript evidence that was discovered, and we discovered much older manuscripts. We've discovered manuscripts from a wider geographical range, and it seems that Mark's Gospel ends in verse 8. And so Mark's Gospel, and if we just accept that for now, and we'll talk about it in more detail when we get to chapter 16, which thank goodness is a long way away, but when we have that resurrection in chapter 16, and he appears and he's resurrected, he says, "Do not be alarmed," verse 6. "You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has risen, he is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and they fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Full stop, end of Gospel. That's a sudden ending, is it not? And it says to me that there's this sense of urgency and the sense of kind of go out. Here it is, it's happened, here's the gospel message, here it is, boom, 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 now go run with it, go take it. There's certainly a sense of urgency in the writing of this gospel. And that leads me to think that I agree with the scholarship that would say this is the first of the gospels. There's an urgency about it. And the other reason there's urgency about it as well is because it seems to be written, and historically, traditionally, it's been handed down to us, accurately or not, that this was written for a Roman audience, in that geographical vicinity anyway. And Roman soldiers would typically be people who were more familiar with action than they were for, say, speech and dialogue. It's kind of like, if you understand this analogy, it's like Mark. See, John, I've always said, is the most film-like of the Gospels. It's like a screenplay. There's scenes that are carefully woven together. The gospel account has been taken and put into a series of scenes that tells the story. And there's this dialogue in between where the actors will come forward and give their big speeches and describe. And Jesus will, has these long dialogue sections towards the end because there's teaching that needs to be given. And it's very much structured like a screenplay almost. If John is a screenplay, it's a screenplay that's going for an Oscar in the drama category. Mark would be a Michael Bay movie, if anyone kind of follows that. It's kind of all action. It's like, you know what? That person said 3 sentences, that's enough, let's have an explosion. It's that kind of thing. And you're going to see that in chapter 1. I mean, we hit chapter 1 and it's exorcism, 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 boom, boom, boom. Immediately afterwards, boom. Immediately afterwards, boom. And it just goes like that. And he doesn't want to wrap things up neatly at the end. Jesus has risen from the dead. Go tell people. Go, boom, done. You know, that's kind of how Mark is. And so I think part of the urgency is to do with the whole Roman mindset. The Roman soldier was the person who responded to action rather than dialogue. They were given a commission, they had to obey the commission, and they went out and fulfilled their commission. And so, when we look at the Gospel of Mark is presenting Jesus as a servant of God. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But he's presenting Jesus as a servant of God who is given a commission and fulfills his commission and goes out and obeys, and who does it. And that's something that they could relate to. And so that is a lot of what's going on here in Mark's Gospel as well. So when we come to chapter 1 and verse 1 next time, we'll see here at the beginning, it says the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And of all the Old Testament books, Isaiah forms the foundation for Mark's Gospel. Isaiah, one of his central motifs, one of Isaiah's central themes was his theme of the servant of Jehovah, the servant of Yahweh, the servant of the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. It was this servant of the Lord who was the Messiah, the messianic figure. He was the one who went and did the will of God. And Mark takes that Messiah, that messianic figure, and he brings that Isaiah's, I was going to try and be clever and say Isaiatic, but that's probably not the term, is it? That Isaiah-like concept, and brings it into Mark's Gospel, and Jesus is presented as this servant. And in fact, as we look at how this is structured, and we'll look through this briefly now, as we look through how this is structured, we'll see that the servanthood of Christ is utterly central to this Gospel. Utterly central. So what happens is we kick off the Gospel. We have in just the first 13 verses of the book, we have the preparation of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, the servant of God. He's prepared. And then, having been prepared, in verse 14, the ministry kicks off. And it kicks off, and off we go, and Jesus is doing his ministry. And Jesus is presented as the mighty Son. The mighty, powerful Son of God. Now, this is another Old Testament messianic theme. The Messiah as the Son of God. Now, what's very interesting to me, as someone who studied John's Gospel a lot more, is that in John's Gospel, Jesus, he avoids the term Son of God. When somebody calls him Son of God, he kind of corrects them. He prefers the term Son of Man. Now, the reason for that is this, that Jesus is the Son of God, but Son of God is a messianic term that the Jews of that day have associated with the mighty second coming of Christ. The Messiah coming and crushing the enemies of God. The Messiah coming as the mighty one, right? So what John's trying to do with his gospel is he is trying to get away from glory in the sense of power. I've often said to you guys that one of the most significant omissions in John's gospel is the only gospel that doesn't mention the transfiguration, which is a ridiculous omission because John was there at the transfiguration. And it's not there because the transfiguration is talking about a glory of Christ that is not the glory that John wants us to focus on. For John, glory is not the bright, shining brilliance of Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration. For John, the glory of Christ is his character. It is the covenant-keeping nature of God manifest in Christ, no more so than on the cross, where the love of God, where Exodus 34 and God's manifestation of his character is seen in the man Jesus Christ on the cross. Where that man who dies a human death is seen to also be God because he manifests the covenant-keeping nature of God. That's John's glory. So John is shying away from this messianic figure that's going to come and kick Roman butt. They don't want to know about that because they're going to get away from that, right? What Mark does is very, very different. What Mark does is he doesn't shy away from the Son of God. He just dives straight into it. Jesus is the mighty Son of God. And with Luke, I said he's got his chronology. With the other Gospels, they have their theme. And Mark, for his thematics, he structures his Gospel into sections. So most of the exorcisms happen in chapter 1. We got like 3 of them. Boom, boom, boom. Exorcism, exorcism, exorcism. So we'll be talking about that in chapter 1 as we get there. He's just got them, and then immediately, exorcism, exorcism, exorcism. And he's painting this picture, and he goes from exorcisms, and he goes to healings, and Jesus basically shows, I am king over all of the enemy. I'm king over Satan, I'm king over the demons, I'm king over sickness, I am the mighty Son of God. He shows who he is. And this mighty Son goes all the way through the first half of Mark's Gospel. Remember, it's not chronological. It's not as if Jesus was mighty and then he stopped being mighty. Right? What Mark is doing is he's taking these events and putting them together in a thematic sequence. So in his telling of the story, the first half of the Gospel is, you're right, here he is, Messiah, Son of God. Right? And that comes right the way through to chapter 8. Through to chapter 8. So end of chapter 7, he's still healing a deaf man. In chapter 8, he is feeding a multitude, and then there's a blind man being healed. At the end of chapter 8, verse 22. And then in verse 27, we come to a crux. And this really is the turning point in Mark's Gospel. And I can talk a bit about this because by the time we get to it, it'll be months down the line, you'll have forgotten, so I can tell you again. So we'll spend a little time looking at this. In verse 27, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? They told him, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now, Peter and his declaration of faith is contained in other Gospels as well. Mark uses it very differently than how John uses it. And this is what excites me about doing a different Gospel, is even though many of the incidents are the same, the purpose of them in the story that's being told is often very different. In John's Gospel, the confession of Peter is all to do with John's theme of belief and believing and the use of the word as opposed to signs. It's all part of that structure. But here in Mark's Gospel, it acts as a turning point. He is the Christ. He's proved himself to be the Christ for the first 8 chapters of the book. He's shown himself to be the mighty Son of God. He's got power over everything, wind and waves and sickness and demons. And he is the mighty Son of God. And so Peter says, you're the Christ. And Jesus says, don't tell anyone. Now that's a twist. And that's something that we're going to have to deal with, is that there is within Mark's Gospel the secrecy. Don't tell people who I am. Don't tell people that you were healed. Don't tell people, these parables are being told so that people can't understand them. There's an element of secrecy in the gospel, and we'll talk about that more as we teach through it and as we come to it. But for now, I simply want us to note that there is a turning point with Peter's confession. He's recognized he, like we the reader, should have come to the conclusion of who Jesus is by this point in Mark's Gospel. He's proved who he is. And then it says in verse 31, the very next verse, he began to teach that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. He didn't say it allegorically. He didn't put it in little stories, illustrations, so they somehow miss it. He looked them in the eyes and said, listen guys, I'm going to die. Now, this is the shift in Mark's gospel. This is the whole structure here, right? Jesus, mighty Son of God, Messiah, power over everything, displays his power. Who do you say I am? You're the Christ. 10 out of 10, Peter, good job. Now that you understand who I am, let me tell you something you're not expecting. I'm going to die. And it's a sudden twist, and everything shifts now. And what happens is, and by the way, one of Peter's, as I said, more basic literary devices is he likes triads. He likes things repeated in threes occasionally. And 3 times now in the end, in this last chapter, he tells the disciples he's going to die, and they don't understand. He tells the disciples that he's going to die, and they just don't understand him. So he said it plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Can you even begin to imagine that picture? But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And that's going to be a fun passage to teach when we get there. But we'll leave it for now. Verse 34, calling to the crowd to him with his disciples, he said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man," notice the shift in title, "be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." So what has he done here? Having established he's the mighty Messiah, he says the Messiah is going to suffer and die. The disciples don't understand, and then Jesus gives them a lesson on how their life is going to be, on how they should live, on what discipleship looks like, which is based on the model of the suffering servant. So what Jesus is doing is he's taking the mighty Son of God Messiah from the prophets, and from Isaiah specifically, and he's taking Isaiah's suffering servant, and he's combining them together and showing that they are one and the same person. Some rabbis at about the time of Christ actually taught that there would be 2 Messiahs. Messiah ben David and Messiah ben Joseph. Messiah ben David was the Messiah who came in glory and came and established the throne and ruled and reigned. But there was also Messiah ben Joseph, which was a name which was very ironically given because, of course, Jesus was his earthly father who raised him was called Joseph, and this wasn't known of it. This was done before that time. But the rabbis would call him Messiah ben Joseph, who would be the Messiah who would come and who would suffer for his people and be this suffering servant of Yahweh. And they did this because they couldn't reconcile these 2 different people. Now, we as Christians tend to separate the 2 pictures of Messiah by saying, well, there's the Messiah of the first coming, right? The suffering servant, and there's the Messiah of the second coming. Mark disagrees with us. Mark says, no. The mighty Son of God Messiah, he came at the first coming too. And he demonstrates it for the first 8 chapters. But the same man, the same God incarnate, is the suffering servant of Jehovah. And that man is the one who will suffer and die. And so his disciples and his followers must also suffer and die. They need to take up their cross. Because if they're following Jesus, they've got to follow him where he goes. In the first half of the gospel, but by the way, in Mark's gospel, one of the themes of Mark's gospel, one of the kind of sub-themes as it were, is that in Mark's gospel, the disciples always end up looking a bit stupid. They get negative press in Mark's gospel, which I think is fairly humbling if you consider that Peter was involved. Traditionally, we believe that Peter was involved in it to some degree. But they don't get good press. But a lot of what happens is them following Jesus, and he's healing and doing this, and they're kind of trying to follow in his footsteps. And they are going to follow in his footsteps. Jesus cast out demons, and they're going to cast out demons. Jesus healed the sick, and they're going to heal the sick. So they are going to follow in the footsteps of Christ, right? But there is this other side to Christ that shifts in this end of chapter 8, where Jesus, who is so mighty, is going to be the mighty one who suffers and dies. And the irony of Mark's gospel is that Jesus, who is this servant Messiah, he exchanges his, it was Michael Bird, the scholar, who says, he exchanges his divine honour for human, is the word ignominy? Is that how you say it? Human shame. He exchanges divine honour for human shame on the cross. He is essentially this crucified king. So Mark spends half of his gospel building up this Messiah, building up Jesus, Son of God, King of the Jews. Here he is, this mighty man who has power over all things. And the irony is that he shows his power by refusing to save himself and by dying on the cross. You see, for John it's all about glory, but for Mark it's much more about power. You want to be powerful? Do you want to have real power? Everybody wants power. We've got power-hungry people all over the place, running big corporations and stuff and wielding their mighty power and their mighty dollar. You want power? Well, God says that real power is seen in putting aside ourselves and sacrificing our lives for the sake of God and for the sake of the gospel. That's power. Jesus was able to come down from that cross. Jesus was able to not go to that cross. He had the power, but he went to the cross. Not in spite of his power, but according to Mark, he went to the cross because of his power. And Mark is combining those two elements of Christ. And like I said, there are 3 times now. So we've seen the one in chapter 8, at the end of chapter 8. And then in chapter 9, it's verses 31 to 37. So read from verse 30 of chapter 9. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know. There's that secrecy again. For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man, notice he's Son of Man now, the suffering servant, the Son of Man, not the glorious Son of God, is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. So again, we have him repeating for the second time that he's going to be killed and suffer. Verse 32, but they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. So again, for the second time, they don't believe him. They don't understand what he's saying. And then in verse 33, they come to Capernaum, and he was in the house, and he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? And they kept silent, for on the way they'd argue with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down, and he called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone will be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. So again, just like in chapter 8, what we have here is him saying he's going to die, the disciples not understanding, and then another lesson in servanthood. Take up your cross and follow me. You've got to be prepared to go to your own cross. I'm suffering and dying, you've got to suffer and die. Here, I'm a servant, and if you want to be the greatest, you've got to be a servant too. And the third time that we have this is in chapter 10. Flick through another chapter to chapter 10 and verse 32. They were on the road, going to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed. And those who followed, and by the way, them being amazed at Jesus constantly is another reoccurring theme of Mark's Gospel. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise. Even more detail this time. And then in verse 35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Let me just read that again. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Isn't that just astonishing? Wow. How many of us are like that though in our prayer lives, eh? God, we just come before you today, Father, because we want to tell you what to do. And there's truth to that, isn't there? And he said to them, how dare you? No, he didn't, funnily enough. He said, what do you want me to do for you? Isn't that interesting? Oh, I can't wait to teach this passage. Anyway, moving on. And they said, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Jesus said, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, to baptize with the baptism I'm being baptized? And they said, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant. It's for those for whom it has been prepared. And when they heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called to them and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So we have a triad within a triad. We have these three incidents, one after the other, in these three chapters. In each one of these incidents, there is a threefold thing. There is Jesus' teaching of his death, the disciples not understanding, explicitly stated the first two times and certainly implied the third time, and then we have a lesson on humility and on servanthood that is given to the disciples in light of the lack of their understanding. They could not combine the two characters of the Messiah. And at the end of chapter 10, that lovely verse 45 of chapter 10, he concludes the third of this triad by saying, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And if you want a verse that sums up the entirety of Mark's gospel, there it is. Jesus, even him, even the Son of Man, the Son of God comes as the Son of Man. He comes in human frailty, and he comes to serve. He doesn't come to be served. He's king. He's king of the Jews. He's the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He's the glorious one. And he is the one who has power over demons. He's the one that has power over the sick. He is the one who is mighty. And yet, he didn't come so that people would serve him. He came to serve other people, because ultimately he was going to give his life to pay the price for our sin that we could never pay. And Mark's gospel is a gospel that takes that theme, that servant Messiah, combines it with the glorious Messiah, shows that Christ was both of them. He spends the first half of the gospel showing us his might. Peter, like us, comes to the understanding of who Jesus is. And then the tricky bit of showing people who recognize that he is the Messiah, the Messiah is going to have to die. And that not only is that not evidence of him lacking power, but it is the ultimate expression of his power, because he is going to heal us from our sin. That's the power of the gospel. And that's the power and the might of Jesus Christ. And so the second half of Mark's gospel, really from that shift in verse 8, and if you like, there's a bit more of a transition through 8 through 10, where he's trying to teach them who he is in this second sense. And the expression, just as in the first half, he's shown himself as the mighty Son of God by the healings, by the exorcisms. In the second half of the book, we have this great, grand expression of the passion of Christ. And some people have considered Mark's gospel to basically be an extended passion of Christ, an extended picture of his death and suffering with just a big foundation. It's very much a central focus of Mark's gospel, because what he is trying to teach them in chapters 8, 9 and 10, that as we come up to say chapter 13ish, he's now going to live, he's living it out practically in those chapters 8 through 12, and then we come to the crucifixion, and we come to his suffering, and we come to what's traditionally known as the passion of Christ, his suffering. And in that, he begun the book with his expression of his power, and he ends the book with the expression of his servanthood. And the message for the reader, the message for the disciple, is very much, as I said before, this action, action, action kind of stuff. He's basically saying, look, here's mighty Jesus, and he's a servant. That's the gospel. That's your call to follow. Go do it. That's what Mark's all about. Mark's gospel does not understand our modern lives of comfort. Doesn't have any understanding of it. I think that Mark's gospel is going to rattle a few cages. I hope so. Scriptures always should, shouldn't they? But here is the one who says, you know what? You're a soldier. You have a commission. Get out and do it. Here's the gospel. Go take it. Call people to suffer like you've been called to suffer. Go take the gospel out into persecution, into the world. Go suffer for Christ. And as we've seen in our Ephesians studies, you have the power of God within you as you go. And that is why I think he wraps things up nicely at the end with that very, very short ending. The short ending with those 8 verses. That later stuff I think was a later addition. Mark ends in verse 8 and he's basically saying he's resurrected, he's gone, and there's a sense of excitement and urgency and fear. And we're left with that picture. And the ending is there kind of abruptly for us to go. Go take this Messiah. Go take this message. Go take this gospel. And go take it to the world. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm more excited about studying Mark together now than I was before we started this tonight. And I hope that for you guys it's a similar effect. So I think we're pretty much there. It's an interesting story. As we hit the second half, he goes in the temple. He starts, and just by way of passing, it's interesting. We know that in John's Gospel, the cleansing of the temple happened very, very early in the ministry of Christ. There's this cleansing of the temple, and Jesus kicks off his ministry in the temple, whips and knocking things over and all of this kind of stuff. And the whole of Jesus' ministry comes from that foundation. In Mark's gospel, he does all of his stuff, and he's this amazing guy, and he does all these miraculous things, and he's a miracle worker. And then the second half of his gospel, he goes into the temple and he knocks things over and he causes a kerfuffle and what have you. Now, scholars can argue about whether there was one cleansing of the temple or whether there were 2, one at the beginning and one at the end. That's not really the point. The point is that whether there was 1 or 2, John has it at the beginning because it sets things up for his gospel. In Mark's gospel, it's set up for that ending where he leads to his conflict and it leads to his persecution. I personally think it happened very early on. I think John is more chronological than Mark. I think that with Mark's gospel, he's telling us a story. He's telling us the story of the mighty Messiah who had power to do all sorts of things. And he chose to use that power to sacrifice himself and to heal us from the ultimate wound, the wound of our sin. It's a great story. We're going to start expounding it next week with chapter 1 and verse 1 and John the Baptist. And I will be blessed if you would come and join us. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word and we thank you for this gospel. Lord, I'm still fearful going into it, fearful that I won't do it justice, that I won't understand it well enough, that I won't have the time or the concentration to invest, Lord. And I just pray that this series on Mark would be used by you mightily. I pray that you in your power would use me in my weakness and that you would bless those who come out to hear. I pray that people at this church would invest their time to come out and hear Mark's gospel. I pray that the gospel would captivate us, just like it would have done in the beginning for those first Christians, hearing the message of the gospel, perhaps through this gospel for the first time. May it captivate us. May we be amazed by Christ as they were amazed by Christ. And may we recognize this servant leader, and may we follow in his footsteps. We ask this for your glory. Amen.